Introduction: Power illusion versus structural reality. The trajectory of India's foreign policy in the post-Cold War era is frequently narrated as a story of inevitable ascent towards great power status. This narrative, however, collapses under analytical scrutiny when examined through the lens of structure and agency. The reality is less flattering. India is not an autonomous power architect shaping outcomes, but a constrained actor navigating a system that it doesn't control. The collapse of bipolarity and the emergence of a unipolar world fundamentally altered the strategic environment, forcing India into reactive posture rather than allowing proactive dominance. The the central tension lies in gap between aspiration and execution. India's foreign policy reflects ambition, but its outcome reveals structural subordination and incomplete strategic conversion. Theoretical framework, structure, agency, and the limits of autonomy. A structural frame a structural agency framework provides the most accurate explanation of India's foreign policy behavior. Structural forces defined by the distribution of power in the international system set the outer boundaries within which states operate. Agency, on the other hand, refers to the decisions, strategies, and policies made by the state's leadership. In theory, a state with sufficient agency can manipulate structural constraints to its advantage. In practice, India demonstrates limited capacity to do so. Structural realism posits that states behave according to systematic pressure, prioritizing survival and scrutiny. However, this framework alone cannot explain why similarly pos- positioned states behave differently. This is where agency intervenes. India's foreign policy reveals that while structural constraints define the rules of the game, domestic variables, leadership choices, and institutional weaknesses determine how effectively those rules are exploited. The persistent failure to align agency with structural opportunity exposes a deeper inefficiency. India reacts to the system rather than reshaping it. Post-Cold War transformation from bipolar constraint to unipolar subordination. The end of the Cold War didn't liberate India, it removed its strategic shield. Under bipolarity, India could leverage the Soviet Union to maintain a degree of autonomy. The transition to unipolarity dominated by the United States eliminated this balancing option, imposed a new hierarchy. The United States emerged as a hegemon capable of unilateral military action without meaningful opposition, as demonstrated in the Gulf War, the Afghanistan intervention, and the Iraq invasion. India's response to this transformation wasn't strategic innovation but adaptive compliance. It engaged in selective bandwagoning, supporting US initiatives where beneficial while avoiding outright confrontation. This behavior was not a sign of strategic sophistication but of structural necessity. India lacked the capability to challenge the hegemon and therefore opted for partial alignment. The absence of any credible counter hegemonic coalition reinforced this dependence, locking India into a system where its rise could only occur within limits tolerated by the dominant power. The illusion of great power status, capability without control. India's foreign policy discourse is saturated with claims of emerging great power status. These claims are undermined by a fundamental contradiction. Material capacity has not translated into strategic control. Economic growth, military modernization, and nuclear capability have increased India's profile, but they have not produced decisive influence over regional or global outcomes. The failure lies in the conversion mechanism. Economic strength doesn't automatically yield geopolitical power. It must be deliberately transformed through coherent strategy, institutional capacity, and sustained policy execution. India hasn't achieved this transformation yet. Instead, it exhibits fragmented responses, inconsistent signaling, and an ability to impose its preference on neighboring states. The result is a state that appears powerful in aggregate metrics but remains strategically limited in practice. Strategic behavior oscillation between balancing and bandwagoning. India's foreign policy behavior reveals a pattern of oscillation rather than coherence. It simultaneously engages in balancing against dominant powers while bandwagoning with them when necessary. This duality is often framed as strategic autonomy, but in reality it reflects indecision and constraint. In its relationship with the United States, India has pursued a hybrid strategy. It has aligned with US interests in counterterrorism and economic cooperation while resisting full integration into US led alliances. This approach allows India to extract benefits without formal subordination but also limits its ability to reshape outcomes independently. Similarly, India's engagement with China combines economic interdependence with strategic rivalry, creating a complex relationship where competition is managed rather than resolved. This pattern indicates a lack of strategic clarity. A true great power defines its position and compels others to respond. India, by contrast, continuously adjusts its position in response to external pressures. Regional dynamics, failure to dominate the immediate environment. The most damaging weakness in India's foreign policy is its inability to control its immediate neighborhood. South Asia remains unstable with persistent conflicts involving Pakistan, strained relations with smaller neighbors, and the influence of external powers such as China. A state that cannot establish regional hegemony cannot transition into global power status. India's interactions with Pakistan, particularly over Kashmir, have resulted in prolonged conflict without resolution. The nuclearization of the region has added a layer of deterrence, but has not eliminated instability. Meanwhile, China's strategic partnership with Pakistan and its expanding influence in South Asia undermines India's regional position. India's failure in this domain is not solely due to external opposition. It reflects a lack of coherent regional strategy and an inability to integrate political, economic, and military tools effectively. The persistence of this weakness ensures that India remains preoccupied with local challenges, preventing it from projecting power globally. Domestic constraints, the internal limits of external power. Foreign policy is not determined solely by external factors, it is filtered through domestic structures. India's internal environment imposes significant constraints on the external ambitions. Political fragmentation, coalition dynamics, and ideological divisions complicate decision making and reduce strategic inconsistencies. The absence of a unified strategic vision is particularly evident in India's approach to major powers. While there is broad agreement on the importance of engaging the United States, political considerations prevent the formation of a stable bipartisan consensus. This results in policy fluctuations that weaken India's credibility and reduce its effectiveness as a strategic actor. Additionally, the lack of a robust intellectual and institutional framework for foreign policy analysis limits India's capacity to anticipate and respond to systematic changes. This result is a reactive policy environment where short-term consideration often override long-term strategic planning. Competing strategic paradigms, pragmatism versus maximalism. India's foreign policy discourse is divided between two dominant paradigms, pragmatis- pragmatic realism and maximist realism. The pragmatic approach emphasizes flexibility, economic growth, and defensive capabilities, prioritizing stability and incremental gains. The maximist approach advocates for aggressive power accumulation, offensive capabilities, and strategic dominance. The coexistence of these paradigms create internal inconsistency. Power decisions oscillate between caution and ambition, preventing the emergence of a coherent grand strategy. While pragmatists focus on economic integration and multilateral agreement, maximalists push for military expansion and assertive positioning. This tension results in diluted outcomes as neither approach is fully implemented. The inability to resolve this internal contradiction reflects a deeper structural issue. India lacks a clear hierarchy of priorities. Without a defined strategic doctrine, its foreign policy remains fragmented and reactive. The China factor, managed rivalry under structural constraint. India's relationship with China represents the most significant external challenge to its rise. The two states are engaged in a complex interplay of competition and cooperation shaped by economic interdependence and geopolitical rivalry. China's rapid economic and military expansion has altered the balance of power in Asia, creating a structural constraint that India cannot ignore. While India seeks to balance China through partnerships and internal capability development, it lacks the capacity to confront it directly. This has led to a strategy of managed rivalry where competition is contained within acceptable limits to avoid escalation. The success of India's rise depends heavily on how it navigates the relationship. Failure to effectively counterbalance China will reinforce India's subordinate position, while the regional hierarchy limits its global ambition. The conversion problem, economic growth without strategic translation. The central weakness of India's foreign policy lies in its inability to convert economic gains into strategic power. Economic capability provides the foundation for influence, but it doesn't automatically translate into geopolitical leverage. The transformation requires deliberate policy choices, institutional coordination, and sustained investment in strategic assets. India's approach to this conversion process is inconsistent. While it has achieved significant economic growth, it hasn't developed the mechanism necessary to translate that growth into influence. This includes limitations in military projection, diplomatic reach, institutional capacity. The result is a state that possesses resources but lacks the ability to deploy them effectively in pursuit of strategic objectives. Conclusion: a contained rise without strategic resolution. India's foreign policy is the in the post-Cold War era is defined by persistent tensions between ambition and limitation. Structural constraints imposed by the international system combined with domestic inefficiencies and strategic inconsistencies have prevented India from achieving true great power status. Its behavior reflects adaptation rather than dominance, oscillation rather than coherence, and aspiration rather than execution. Unless India resolves its internal contradictions, establishes regional dominance, and develops a coherent mechanism for converting economic power into strategic influence, its trajectory will remain incomplete. The corresponding authority, the system doesn't reward ambition, it rewards control. India has not yet demonstrated the ability to exercise that control.